Hey folks, today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite topics, and that is Sonic the Comic. The fortnightly comic that publisher Fleetway put out in the 1990s, that informed a lot of old school British fans' perspectives on the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. I'm always happy to see people interested in the Fleetway comics, and it's been a joy to help in sharing some of the comic's awesome characters with you all. But one peculiar thing about the comics seems to bug a lot of new or unfamiliar fans: Sonic himself. I've seen accusations that Fleetway Sonic is a jerk, and not just a jerk to Robotnik, which is to be expected. You've probably seen a few of these comic panels floating around on Twitter or Reddit before, of Fleetway Sonic getting really personal and nasty with buddies like Tails. They're some of the more infamous and widely distributed panels from the comic, and they definitely seem to paint Fleetway Sonic in an unflattering and off-putting light. In this video, I want to try to answer the simple question: is Fleetway Sonic a jerk? Well, the short answer is yes. There's no denying it, really. There's plenty of evidence to support the claim. The same cocky attitude that Sonic regularly deployed to smack talk and humiliate his enemies was often also used against meek friends who looked up to him, like Tails or Porker Lewis, which frankly made Sonic look like a bit of a bully. There's an almost endless collection of panels where Sonic unfairly berates and insults his close friends, and he's often reprimanded for it by the likes of Amy Rose. Sometimes, Sonic's insults can render his victims teary-eyed. I've seen evidence that this rather toxic portrayal of Sonic has put off some newer fans from diving into Sonic the Comic and having a read of it for themselves. I've also seen Fleetway Sonic declared as one of the worst versions of the character because of his attitude. So, rather than asking whether Fleetway Sonic is a jerk, which he is, what I want to do is try to explain why this is only really half the story. Sonic is a jerk, but there's more, much more to his character than that. One important thing to note is that Fleetway Sonic is not an entirely one-dimensional character. Yes, he's sometimes rude and horrible, but it's pretty evident that Sonic's attitude is masking something. Throughout the comic's run, Sonic's thought bubbles or monologues reveal insecure and nervous thoughts and feelings which often directly contradict the kind of ultra-confident front that Sonic puts on. That mean-spirited side is a result of Sonic's own insecurities. As Mobius's resident saver of worlds, he does have an immense amount of responsibility on his shoulders. There's one particular panel that I've seen floating around a lot in which Sonic utterly destroys Porker Lewis for wanting to leave the Freedom Fighters. Sonic gets particularly nasty here, bringing Lewis to tears when he exclaims, "You were always soft, Porker. We're probably better off without you anyway." It's a comment that warrants Amy Rose to step in and tell Sonic to back off. Writer Nigel Kitching has actually weighed in on this particular strip. Here's what he had to say about it. Sonic grilled Porker, quote, because he didn't want Porker to go, not because he despised him for his cowardice, but because he was just so desperate for Porker to stay. It's just Sonic's inability to express his feelings get him so screwed up. Later in the issue, when Sonic has come to terms with Lewis's decision to leave, you can tell that Sonic is on the verge of an apology. He's matured, at least a little bit, but he's still struggling to fully express himself. This is, in my opinion, a daring level of depth for the character. I'm not sure that a more stringent Sega would allow Sonic to be portrayed like this nowadays, but frankly, it's one of the reasons I liked Sonic more than more cuddly characters like Mario or Kirby back in the day. Sonic was a fully realized three-dimensional character. Of course, there were plenty of times when Sonic was the coolest guy in the room, when he was incredibly empathetic, and when he was a traditional hero. But he had his character flaws too. Tails probably receives the most abuse, regularly being called Pixel Brain by Sonic. Sonic and Tails have a kind of big brother-little brother relationship in the comic. Sonic can indeed be nasty to Tails, but he can also be supportive and inspiring. It's reflective, perhaps, of a real-life brotherly relationship, with all the ups and downs. It's also interesting that, along with being a jerk, Fleetway Sonic is fairly thin-skinned. When Amy, who enjoys trolling Sonic from time to time, bugs Sonic, he can rarely take it in good spirits, always irritated by her. It goes to show that he can dish it out, but he can't really take it. Another character flaw. There's also at least a couple of panels where the reader is supposed to shake their head in embarrassment at Sonic's bravado. For example, here's a panel where an oblivious Sonic is too busy insulting Tails to spot the Bolt hurtling towards him. Sonic is a flawed character, and he's a little ball of insecurity, so there is at least some depth and explanation for his attitude. It seems like it's a characteristic that Sonic shares with Spider-Man, who also has a habit of smack-talking his enemies out of a sense of nervousness. It's just that for Sonic, he often takes things a little too far. Furthermore, if you follow the course of the entire comic, which effectively ran for 7 years between 1993 and 2000, I think you'll see that Sonic definitely grows and matures by the comic's tail end. Sonic has plenty of moments where he shows every emotion imaginable, including regret and remorse for some of his actions. Rather touchingly, the final series of strips, which retells the events of Sonic Adventure, shows an emotionally tender Sonic who actually sheds a tear over his buddy Johnny Lightfoot. Johnny is someone who's received his fair share of Sonic saltiness, but tragically died fighting the villainous Chaos. I'd like to think that this maturing kind of recontextualizes Sonic's earlier jerkishness as a more immature phase of his life that he began to grow out of. What's especially interesting is that after Sonic the Comic's untimely demise, fans continued making unofficial issues online. The fan continuation of Sonic the Comic even attracted the writing and artistic talents of old-school Sonic the Comic staffers, including Nigel Kitching. In issue 261 of the fan comic, Kitching wrote a strip in which a past version of Sonic travels to the present time with Johnny Lightfoot. The past Sonic and the present Sonic end up tussling, with the present Sonic entirely fed up with the cocky attitude of his past self, and the condescending and frankly insulting way that past Sonic talks about Johnny. In my eyes, that's Kitching showing us what a journey Sonic has been on. That's the kind of character growth that you'd be hard-pressed to find with Sonic in other forms of media. Now, don't get me wrong, I like modern Sonic. I like the Sonic from the movies and the IDW comic books and the modern games. I think Sega are quite protective of Sonic and don't want him to be portrayed in any overtly negative ways. But that's exactly what Fleetway did. Who hasn't lashed out at a friend before? Fleetway Sonic is relatable, and he's a real dude. You'd never see Sonic have the same range of emotions that he does in the Fleetway comic in modern media. It's a shame, but it's for all of these reasons that I don't hate Fleetway's jerk Sonic, because it's just one facet of an excellent interpretation of the character. Now, okay, you might not be entirely convinced by all of that, you might still hate jerk Sonic, and you might ask yourself, were Fleetway's writers really that darn good? Did they really put a long multi-year character arc for Sonic in place from the very beginning? Well, in reality, I think there's a couple more reasons why Sonic was conceived as a bit of a jerk from his debut, and it's important to understand them. One reason to keep in mind is Sonic's Fleetway personality was largely in line with how Sonic was being advertised to the wider audience, particularly in the West. Sonic is very child-friendly nowadays, but when he debuted in 1991, Sega desperately wanted their new mascot character to stand out in the gaming landscape. The rather cute, laid-back Japanese version of Sonic was given a bit of edge when he was exported to America, the UK, and elsewhere. Advertising campaigns tried to reiterate that Sonic was a bit of a bad boy, especially in comparison to Nintendo's Mario. You can see this in TV ads and print ads.
Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
Heck, there was a series of rather infamous Sega ads in the British adult comic magazine Viz that are adult-oriented to say the least. Even Sonic's passive-aggressive, impatient toe-tapping in-game was a big deal at the time and further fed into that image of Sonic as a bit of a no-nonsense dude. Sonic was a little bit naughty, a little bit edgy, a little bit Bart Simpson back then, so his rather abrasive Fleetway personality was kind of in keeping with how he was being portrayed by the wider marketing machine. That is to say, it's hard to imagine this Sonic being a big old meanie to Tails, but not necessarily this Sonic. There's a second key reason. why I think Sonic was written the way he was in the Fleetway comics, and that reason is British culture. Yeah, we're all horrible here. You don't need a PhD in British studies to read and enjoy Sonic the Comic, but it's important to know that British pop culture had an enormous impact on the comic, with plenty of characters being based on British celebrities and pop culture treasures. In my previous Fleetway videos, I've seen a lot of perhaps newer fans drawing parallels between Fleetway characters and, for example, Dragon Ball characters. Commenters have pointed out the similarities between Supersonic and Broly, or Techno and Bulma. As valid as these comparisons might be, I'm pretty sure that the main troupe of writers and artists behind the comic didn't intentionally draw any inspiration from Dragon Ball or manga at all, to be honest. Fleetway writers have often overtly cited Marvel Comics as serving as an inspiration for some of their creations, but I think the most obvious influence on Sonic the Comic is the British comic industry, and this is where the root of Sonic's characterization really lies. Nestled comfortably alongside Sonic the Comic in stores would have been kids' comics like The Beano, The Dandy, and Buster. A lot of the characters in these comics were also real pieces of work, regularly bantering with, insulting, and beating each other. Britain's premier comic book character is probably the Beano's mischievous mascot Dennis the Menace. As the name suggests, he causes mayhem and creates misery wherever he goes. He insults and assaults pretty much everyone around him, including his dad, his teacher, and his arch-rival Walter, as well as strangers and passers-by. But the thing about Dennis is that he wasn't an exception. So many characters were like this. In fact, it was the modus operandi of kids' comics to kind of be as mean as possible. Every single character bantered with each other and called each other horrible nicknames in every single issue. Most kids' comic characters make Sonic look like a pushover in comparison. Some fans have drawn the line at Sonic's behaviour, but there's a certain grim nastiness to some of these old kids' comic strips, particularly ones from before my time. In a lot of them, you're basically encouraged to just laugh at bullying. They're made worse because, as humour comics, they're totally devoid of the three-dimensional character development found in Sonic the Comic. The bottom line is, Sonic's personality is on the less heinous side of the scale compared to other children's comic book characters of the time. You'd also find adult-oriented comics like the celebrated sci-fi compendium 2000 AD next to Sonic the Comic. 2000 AD is home to, among other subversive characters, Judge Dredd. Dredd is pretty well known the world over at this point. He's a police officer, living in a dystopian future in which most of humanity exists in crime-infested, overpopulated megacities. Dredd isn't exactly a hero in the traditional Superman-style sense. He's brutal, unempathetic, and inspired, in fact, by fascist dictators. Sometimes as a reader, you find yourself cheering for Dredd. Other times you find yourself wishing he'd be a little less vitriolic, to say the least. I think it speaks volumes that Dredd, a thinly veiled satire of authoritarianism with a gruff, stoic personality, is Britain's paramount comic book hero. Not quite your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, is he? A lot of 2000 AD's characters are painted by a certain moral ambiguity, just like Dredd. Most Sonic the Comic writers and artists worked on comics like 2000 AD and the Beano either before or after their Sonic the Comic stint. Looking at somewhat unpleasant cultural juggernauts like Dennis the Menace and Judge Dredd, it's easy to imagine that Sonic's personality was written, at least partially, with their personalities in mind. Perhaps to people unfamiliar with British comics, Sonic might come off as overly abrasive. But he's written in a way that isn't unusual for the British comics industry, and compared to some beloved characters here, he's practically a saint. That just about winds up my thoughts and feelings on Fleetway Sonic being a jerk, but before I close this one out, I need to say there's plenty of other a-holes in the comic too. Take a look at how the Chaotix treat and talk about Charmy the Bee. It's all just banter, I guess. Towards the end of the writing process for this video, I found an excellent thread that basically covered all of the same points I wanted to make in this video on Twitter. It's by Shame, who has made some riveting Sonic videos himself, So I encourage everyone to check out his Twitter thread for a little bit more detail on this topic, and his channel for some great Sonic takes too. With that, I'm done. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.